Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Migrating to M365, Are You Ready? My name is Marissa with ActiveNav, and we're so pleased that you're able to join us today. We have a great presentation in store, and I know our panelists are really excited to share their knowledge and their insights. That is all from me, so I will go ahead and pass it over to our panelists for introductions. And Chris, we will start with you.
Hi, I'm Chris Plowshin, Director of Cloud and Infrastructure Solutions for Ricoh Canada. In my current role, I oversee both the public and private cloud infrastructure that powers the software solutions offered by Ricoh. In addition, I manage the security policy design, technology vendor relations, and ISO compliance within Ricoh eDiscovery. My first introduction to Microsoft 365 migration was Ricoh eDiscovery's own migration from Exchange, completed in early 2015. And I have to say, if only I knew then what I know now about migrating. Mekonnen?
Great, thank you. My name is Mekonnen Kasa, and I am actually with Microsoft's Cloud Security Engineering, specifically with Customer Experience Engineering team. Our team helps our customers consume and deploy Microsoft security products, including Azure Information Protection, Microsoft Information Protection, and now Azure Purview, which is designed to help our customers protect their structured data. And we, most of the time, work with our customers, high-value customers, to help them migrate and deploy and protect themselves in the cloud environment.
And hello, everyone. Steve Matthews. I'm a Senior Vice President of Global Accounts at ActiveNav and have been in the US for the last 10 years, despite the accent. I work with our large, complex accounts and have been heavily involved with clients making massive transformations, moving to the Microsoft Cloud with the likes of Southern California Edison out in California and Plains Midstream, Canada. So what we're going to cover today is our joint experiences in the market and really what we're seeing and living on a daily basis. And importantly, the challenges that organizations face, because there are many. And then providing some insight for paths to success, because you can be very successful with these migrations, but there's a lot of work. And what we see is that using the ActiveNav software is a real force multiplier for the 365 environment and very complementary in the terms that there's huge amounts of data that's been collected over the years that can be mapped, cleaned, tagged, and migrated, and minimizing the disruption to the business. So these are some of the things that we're going to share with you today, followed by a Q&A at the end of the webinar. I think this really sums it all up. Many organizations that we've spoken with have talked about, we're moving to the cloud, that's going to solve all our problems. Completely wrong. That old adage of garbage in, garbage out has never been truer. You're going to hear us talk a lot today about people, process, and technology. Those three things are all interlinked. It's like three legs on a stool. If you remove one of those legs, the stool's going to fall over. And one of the things, the very first thing I would say to anyone considering these programs is don't forget about the change management. Moving to the cloud is fantastic and will transform the business, but there's a whole change management piece that's required. And embrace that disruption so that you can grow. Likewise, don't underestimate the challenges. Again, it's not as simple as, or shouldn't be as simple as, let's just move everything to the cloud. Because you'll have created data over many, many years, lots of unloved data where you don't know what it is, you don't know where to start. And quite often we see some of these programs just parked because it's too difficult. And as part of these migrations, what's at risk, as we'll see. And then we've also seen this, I'm obviously not going to name the client. They moved to the cloud, didn't do any preparation work for the migration, switched it on, were really pleased with themselves until on the very first day, people started searching SharePoint and found all sorts of exec HR pay information. because when you move to the cloud and you make information more accessible, it's more findable. So these are all the reasons why you want to prepare properly. There is a path to success. And again, we're going to share our experiences and provide insights on how we have seen organizations be successful, whether they're small, mid-sized, or even the large corporations. And what are the key tips that we can help provide that will give some help in towards making successful programs. So just going to let you read this. I'm not going to cover every bullet point here. I'm sure you're all pretty familiar with pretty much everything on this list, because it's something we hear time and time again. And so for any of you that are looking at migration programs, rest assured you're not alone with some of the challenges and the problems or the complexity. And here at ActiveNav, and working in partnership with Ricoh and Microsoft, our goal, which is really aspirational, is to get you to zero dark data. What does that mean? We see the first bullet. We don't know what we don't know. We ask this question of every organization, and no one can articulate what data they truly have. They're able to say, we think it's about X, Y, or Z, but we're not sure. We don't know how much data we have. And so being able to shine a light on, if you want to call it this, your corporate dark web, where you just don't know what level of risk is in there, what information is important, what is not important, then starting from the ground up and being able to understand what you have is going to be so important. And we've seen surveys that say that over 68% of all data is deemed as dark data by organizations. And so that's not a good starting point when you're looking at a cloud transformation program.
One of the early misconceptions I would say about Microsoft 365 is that it's a simple switch for your email. You're basically taking what goes through Exchange Server today and throwing it up into the cloud and letting Microsoft deal with the management of that Exchange Server and how to get, send, and receive that email. But that's simply not the case. The case is Microsoft 365 can transform your entire business. So it can transform the way that you work with data, the way that you work with each other, and ultimately the way that you communicate. So part of that is really trying to figure out what parts of your business are good candidates for the different components of Microsoft 365. So email is a natural, but ultimately there are other components too, such as SharePoint or OneDrive or Teams, that you're going to want to look at and see if it fits with the way that you work today. Ultimately, you need to do in-depth research into how all of the different parts of your business are working and how ultimately that all comes together within the entire data universe. You want to make sure that you understand what people need access to, how they need access to it, and how they need to communicate across each other so that you ultimately end up securing all of that. Once you've mapped out everything that is happening within the organization, it makes it much easier to start to talk about what goes, how that goes, and prioritize the different moves that you're going to make as you go to get there. You also want to revisit this on an ongoing basis. Data within an organization is ultimately a living organism. Every single moment, something changes within that data universe. And you want to make sure that you stay on top of that. But the processes themselves that function within that data universe and ultimately use the data are a living organism too. Every time somebody gets involved, they may make a tweak here or there. And even in tightly regulated environments, those little tweaks can add up to a huge change in the ultimate process flow within the organization. And those need to be taken into account as you start to not only plan, but ultimately move into that migration phase of the project. You want to make sure that you're looking at individual data points as they come in, but put those individual data points together to see what those changes mean to the overall process and make sure that that's taken into account. And then you also want to make sure that you're prioritizing different areas so that you're saying, certain things are easy to move and we can do that quickly, and we can have huge success very quickly as part of that and build momentum for the project. But you also want to identify the risks involved. So there may be areas of the business that need different compliance requirements. For instance, you may have data residency requirements in some areas of the business, and for international companies, this is often an issue. And that can take a long time to solve, and it may not play into your project plan completely. So ultimately, you want to take a look at all of those different components, map all of the content within that data universe, and then make informed decisions about where to go next.
That's good points there. I think that to Steve's point earlier, it all pivots from knowing what you have. Once you do the discovery, right, of what you have, then mapping that what you have discovered along these lines that Chris talked about is definitely the first step that needs to be done. At the same time, in addition to these things, right, the specific data situation, there is also the systemic situation you need to take into consideration, right, in terms of size, for example. What's the size of the data that I have? What are really the networking requirements, the latency requirements that I have? There are these data usage, user related parameters also you need to discover and map so that it can help you do your migration better.
So the one thing, I come from an IT background, and in a perfect world, I could simply just dictate exactly how things were going to go and people would follow that. And everything would ultimately be perfect. Actually, in a perfect world, there would be no users and I could just set process in place and everything would run smoothly and there would never be a change to that. But that's not actually how the world works. And as with any project, a migration project ultimately relies on good communication. And that communication ultimately has to be two ways. The communication can't simply go from one party, IT, down and filter through the different areas of the organization, but rather that needs to happen somewhat organically to inform IT before decisions are made around what's going to happen with each area of that. But similarly, IT needs to make sure that they're giving their advice to satisfy the various parts of the business. And then the last component of that communication needs to be interdepartmental too. Ultimately, as you create your data inventory and you start to map out what there is out there, you want the various areas to be able to talk to each other to see where there's commonality and how things can be treated similarly, and ultimately where there are big differences and we need to set up different rules or different processes in place to deal with that. And as you start to look at areas like privacy and data governance, there's overlap there. There's natural overlap there as you go through that. And you want to really take advantage of that overlap where it's possible, and then really map out what those differences are so that you can ultimately address those differences in a different way than you're addressing the similarities. The other piece to this is a project of this type is a perfect time for you to actually go through all of that data universe and really start understanding what's out there. So to Steve's point, people tend to hoard some of this data up front. People don't necessarily want to make decisions. In a past life, I actually worked for a company that had record centers, and record centers are essentially big warehouses filled with boxes that are filled with paper. And 99.5% of that paper goes into those warehouses and is never looked at again. But there is nobody within the business who ever wants to decide to destroy anything. And there are real risks associated with that, but at the end of the day, that just ends up costing money because it's sitting there on a shelf not being addressed by anyone. And that move from an office into a record center for paper copies or boxes of paper is very similar to what we're talking about here. Ultimately, if you're going to take what exists today and simply migrate it, you're not getting the full benefit of going through the process of actually looking at that first and making sure that you're making smart decisions about what ultimately gets migrated.
And I believe Craig raised a question, sort of saying, is dark data the new rot? we at ActiveNav would say yes, because our tagline is zero dark data. And rot, redundant, obsolete, and trivial can mean many different things to many different people. And so when we define dark data, it's understanding and extracting the value. And that plays nicely into this whole concept of triaging your data. And again, I would say probably the number one thing I would say after what we've already said is don't try and do it all in one sitting. And you want to break the problem down into manageable chunks and using step-by-step processes and methodologies to bring the business along, and don't just think of this as an IT program. And so when we talk about triaging, the first thing we want to be able to do is, after that data mapping exercise, is identify the data that really has no business value, that really will not be in scope for migration. A customer example of this is Plains Midstream Canada, that were moving terabytes of data, and we're going to cover this later, to Microsoft 365. But over 50% of that data was deemed to be out of scope after that initial data mapping exercise. By being able to illustrate and shine a light on that dark data to understand what was truly out there. And when we talk about the triaging, it can mean many different things. We want to concentrate on that useful data, and creating metadata tagging around the content is supremely important, because it's going to make the content more usable and more findable once it's in M365. If you rely on users, and again, and I'm sure you're going to have a viewpoint on this, but if you rely on users to manually tag content, in our experiences, what we found, a lot of users have no interest in doing that and will just select the first thing in a list, which means, again, that old adage of garbage in, garbage out. And making sure that content is correctly structured, correctly labeled, correctly tagged, means that your M365 environment is going to thrive.
Well, in addition to correctly, right, and also in defense of users, right, sometimes we tend to complicate these classifications, if you will, right? We have seen some customers that have 14 layers of classification, right? We at Microsoft only have like 5, right? And we try to make it easy. So we have public, general, business, and confidential, highly confidential. I think they're around like that. Just make sure when you classify your data, keep it simple so that users can easily understand that they can do it. Also, you can even have some automation that can actually help you classify this data appropriately based on the content, based on some keywords within those containers, file containers there.
100% agreement with that, because that plays beautifully into, well, how do we categorize our data? Well, you want to categorize it to make it more accessible. And to McKennan's point, is also to be able to use a lot of the capability within M365 to inherit metadata based on where things get stored, to reduce the burden on the users. And in terms of categorization, it means different things to different people. It could be identifying official records in the organization and mapping that against a retention schedule so that retention can be managed in the new environment. It could be that you want to create taxonomies of interest, for example, asset numbers or pipeline equipment numbers. Could be a case of taking your Wild West file share data and just restructuring and reorganizing that in order that people can find information more effectively. And to the point that was just raised, not having folders that go down 30 levels and trying to consolidate both from a permissions and findability perspective. And the sensitivity and privacy aspects are super important, what we're going to cover. I would say that what we have seen as a real win for organizations is, again, people, process, technology. You want to bring the users with you while minimizing the disruption to them. One of the things that we have found to work very, very successfully is running workshops. And those workshops are with nominated individuals from different business areas, no more than an hour, hour and a half at a time. whereby we can shine a light on that dark data so they understand what's there, so they can triage it, but also so that we can start mapping it against all the various organizational requirements. And human behavior being what it is, what we have found is those departments that are most resistant to start with, if we run this workshop process, develop the empathy with them, bring them in, we find that they go from being the biggest detractors to the program to the biggest and most vocal supporters. Chris.
So ultimately then, where do we start? So as we mentioned, realistically, it's to figure out what's out there, and then build a project plan based off of what you know that's out there and how you actually want it to look at the end. So the first step really is to discover and cleanse what you have. So minimize what you're bringing over. So clean up that rot or dark data, and understand what's out there. And then, as Steve mentioned, start to use that metadata to your advantage. So all files have that metadata as part of it. And let's actually see what's out there based off of that metadata and use that as part of it, but also figure out what you want to take over from the metadata into the new platform and set it up so that you can use that metadata going forward, that you just don't lose everything that's been built up over time. And that can be incredibly important if you're moving from one file management system to another. You want to maintain, what classifications people may have put on files, any kind of retention scheduling that might be assigned to those files. You may want to keep that, but you're going to want to look at it first and make sure that it still applies. To Steve's point again, you want to restructure everything and start to move the files around so that the layout makes sense, so that you're building that layout for the future. You're not just simply moving over what exists today. And then ultimately, you want to use a migration tool to relocate everything properly to where you need it to be in the future. And then ultimately, probably the most important step in all of this is to go back and test and make sure that everything went through correctly. You want to make sure that your migration was successful, and that it's working for all areas of the business, because again, we want to make sure that we're communicating with all areas of the business, and that although one area may be served by the migration and everything went perfectly, if everybody else can't find anything or can't access the data the way that they need to use their workflow appropriately, it's not ultimately going to be a success. So you want to go back and you just want to make sure that everything carried over properly, but also any processes that you put in place for the future. So if you are putting folders in place in the future, that they're actually working correctly, and that any automation that you've put in place is ultimately working properly as well.
And we now move on to about the security labeling, the sensitivity labeling of content. And this is something we are really excited about with the advances that have been made, because so many of our clients are really concerned about, well, one, we don't know what data we've got. Two, we don't know what's at risk and what happens if we get breached. And one of the things that we will say to folks is, don't be the next Equifax, because it's not just about the cost of remediating the breach. There's also the reputational damage, and that takes years to recover from. And so it's so important that content is secured and protected. And with the MIP, Microsoft Information Protection, and the sensitivity labeling is incredibly powerful to help you both from permissions management, encryption, data loss prevention, amongst many other things. The crux of the issue here is all of these wonderful controls to secure and protect your data will only work as well as the data is labeled. Because if
no problem. So at Microsoft, of course, I think one of the things that for companies who are trying to migrate currently, one of the advantages that they have is that they are actually not trailblazers, right? There are so many companies who have done that, and this is a tried and tested service and the migration also a beaten path. So in that sense, you have some of the challenges figured out for you. The other thing that to think about is, again, as I said earlier, there are the systems and the scenarios that you need to think about. What kind of scenarios do you have? Do you have any specific scenarios where you're filing, where you're sharing files with some third party or fourth party? What are really the specific scenarios that you have? You really need to figure those out so that your scenarios are going to be met by the services Microsoft provides in the cloud. Again, earlier I also talked about the systems, right? The networks and what have you, and the size of the file that you need to think about, and how long is that going to take to migrate that, right? That's really some of the things that you need to think about. And then Microsoft also has tools already available for you, you can leverage to help you migrate, whether you want to migrate in a big bang one time, which I discourage, or in a phased or staged or wave fashion. With all that said, Microsoft has actually offers what it calls a Microsoft Information Protection for M365. Now, as you can see in the picture there, the information protection, once you have done your taxonomy definition, once you have discovered what you have, and you have created your sensitivity taxonomy to say, hey, public, general, confidential, and what have you, that label can be actually be available in Microsoft Security and Compliance Center. You can go create it there. And all these Microsoft 365 products will inherit these sensitivity labels and apply them across all the products, including your SharePoint, including your mail, including Office, Teams, and even Power BI now. Not only that, we also provide DLP capability available to help you leverage our data loss prevention. The other thing that we actually do is we also provide these same functionalities in the on-prem environment. So if you're not already in the cloud, what I suggest is what I think it works better is to run some of these tools that can actually help you discover and apply CLP. We call them classification, labeling, and protection on-prem, and then in a staged fashion, migrate them to 365 because you have already done some of the work there. So migrating them to the cloud will be as smooth as possible because you have already discovered and labeled them using the Microsoft products on-prem, and that will be easier to transition to the cloud.
We actually had a question come in from Christy. I think this is a nomenclature thing, asking, are these referred to as unified labeling now?
Yes, so that's actually a very good question. So the person probably uses Azure Information Protection. There was, well, there still is a product that I manage called Azure Information Protection. So that was the tool that you install on top of your Office that helped you apply CLPs, right? Classification, labeling, and protection. Now, Microsoft has gone into a strategy where all these information protections are going to be available within the product out of the box, as you can see here. When you install Office or consume Office, SharePoint, or what have you, embedded, already built in within the product, these functionalities will be available. Now, since Microsoft is now in this midstream, yeah, we're going from AIP to MIP, we created what we call unified labeling. So this unified labeling is an evolution of AIP, but a little bit behind MIP. But if you use unified labeling and start using the labels created in Microsoft Compliance Center and the unified labeling client, you're almost there to consume these built-in functionalities when you're already ready to get there. All you have to do is just uninstall unified labeling and start consuming the built-in functionality already. So unified labeling, if you're using unified labeling, you are almost 80% there to use the built-in information protection provided by Microsoft. Is that clear? It confuses a lot of people because we have the legacy system and the future aspiration system, and Microsoft is right now in between.
And it looks like if there was a thumbs up, Christy would have given you a thumbs up for that response. So, and I think that's really important, because another question that came in is, what about mislabeling? And I think that this is a really good point, and this has been touched upon about as part of the migration effort. And so we have clients today that are using the ActiveNav solution to actually understand what data is in scope, but more importantly, to also look at applying the labels to the content pre-migration and being able to run it against the data classification that are in use. And that becomes very powerful because, one, again, you don't have to ask users to manually tag every file that's being moved in. And based on the structure, you could inherit some of these classification labels as well. But it also becomes really important, perhaps on an ongoing basis, that if users are manually applying a label, we can actually monitor those labels to actually flag and highlight content that looks like it may have been mislabeled and recommend what the correct label should be. And so there's that housekeeping.
Even more than that, as a matter of fact, I don't want to sound like a Microsoft salesperson here. Just to talk about the functionalities available there. Actually, we can look at the labels that you have applied currently and the policies that you have created and make the adjustments based on the new policies. And in addition to that, we actually have this is an overused cliche, but artificial intelligence on top of this data that can actually learn. We call them adaptable or learn classifiers or something like that. That can actually learn about what kind of classifications that you have applied to what kind of data, and these systems can go actually discover that and relabel or apply new labels to data that is being constantly created. I think you earlier talked about there is just an explosion of data, especially given the current operating environment, right? With the pandemic, perimeter-less environment, everybody working from everywhere, using all kinds of devices and creating all kinds of data, accessing data from all kinds of places, from all kinds of devices. You are going to need a scalable solution. You're not, users are good, you rely on them because they know what they're doing, but that is not scalable. So you're going to need some scalable automated system like that can help you discover, label, classify, and at the same time, provide the users the opportunity to override when appropriate, but we'll go log all of that overriding activity. So all that is available within the M365 environment.
And I think we've got time for one more question that came in, because I think this is very, very relevant, from Peggy, who's asking how exceptions can be addressed. For example, a contract in negotiation process that becomes publicly or internally available once the contract is signed off.
Well, again, those are the scenarios that I talked about, right? So what kind of scenarios do you have, and what kind of policies do you want to create around those scenarios, right? And that can be accommodated, right? So it will be, it's hard for me to say, yeah, you can do this, you can do that, but definitely you can have policies within policies and create exception to that policy if you need, depending on what kind of document it is, what content it has, and who is supposed to access it at what time and where.
That's great. So basically it's all about managing that data through the life cycle of it, from creation to sharing.
Yes, and the scenarios are important. That's why I keep going to scenarios, right? Every company, they have they deal with all kinds of different data, right? Some with health data, some with privacy data, some with intellectual property data, some with some architecture data, right? CAD files, PDF files, contractual files, whatever the case may be, right? What are those file types that you're dealing with, and in what kind of situation, from where? Also, when you talk about cloud, you have this global presence, right? Where, in what country, and under what jurisdiction are you dealing with? So all the scenarios need to be figured out before you go to the migration. And because at the end of the day, you don't want to disrupt operations, right? At the end of the day, you don't want to stop business. You're migrating to the cloud in order to optimize your cost and improve your operations, but you don't want inadvertently impact that.
Fantastic. Thanks ever so much. So what we want to do is just share one example among many of a major success where we're looking at large volumes of critical data. So this isn't just any old data, this is critical data and crown jewel data, and how we've helped organizations manage from where they are today with like, oh my gosh, where do we start? All the way through to getting that into the M365 environment. And very importantly, again, going back to one of the points McKenna made, which is being able to inherit metadata to prevent the need for users to have to create lots and lots of tagging and labels. So this was Plains Midstream Canada out in Calgary, and they were looking at moving to M365, huge amounts of data, well into the tens and tens of terabytes of data. They thought that they had a lot of rot within that content, but they couldn't be sure. Going back to the dark data analogy, they didn't know what they didn't know. We were pleased to be successful on an RFP response and deployed with Plains. And over the last 18 months to 2 years, we've been helping them with this major transformation program, moving away from file shares to an M365 environment, but moving the critical assets and making that findable, both from an auditing perspective, as well as from a findability perspective. Really interestingly, running that data discovery, that data mapping right up front, over 50% of the content was deemed to be out of scope for migration. Imagine, less than half of the data you have to worry about. That's a big, big thing, particularly when you're talking of tens, hundreds, sometimes even petabytes of data. More importantly, again, the disruption to the business operations, that was minimized. And then actually did a side-by-side comparison and calculated it would have taken over 9 person years to achieve what was accomplished in a matter of months. And this has allowed Plains to get much better visibility into their data, identify that critical information, identify gaps in business processes, and migrate that content to SharePoint. And more importantly, because of the way the content's been restructured, the vast majority of metadata can be inherited based on where those folders reside within libraries and site collections, minimizing the amount of effort that the users have had to utilize to prepare and tag that content. So we have ongoing governance here. You could call it ongoing maintenance. And if we think about design, build, and run, so the design and build is when we're getting ready for the migration, and run is when we're in production in our new environment. Fantastic. All the problems are solved. Not so quick. Don't look at this as a one and done process. This is an ongoing process within the organization. Always use the analogy. It's like cleaning out your garage. Do it once, looks fantastic, spick and span. Do nothing for the next 6-9 months, becomes a real mess again. and you have to repeat the process all over again. Having done all of that hard work, having all these policies and processes in place, utilize the fantastic capability within the M365 platform that's been really eloquently described by McKenna. And because by continually using software like ActiveNav, you can keep that information current, help with that streamlined business collaboration, utilize those advanced security features that have been described, even feeding, looking to find data as you're starting to use more of the AI features potentially within M365, such as Cortex, making sure that you're supplying good data to feed that training of the Cortex platform to identify the right content. And checking to make sure that where users are tagging data, that it's labeled correctly or tagged correctly. So again, going back to this point, auditing and profiling and identifying exceptions so that those exceptions can be reviewed and updated so that you're maintaining that good and that clean environment.
So ultimately, after having gone through this process for ourselves and with a number of different clients, what did we ultimately learn? I think the number one is to try and break this down into bite-sized chunks. Don't try and do everything all at once. So plan accordingly, take a look at what you have, and then ultimately break that down into individual components that you can move on an ongoing basis. A simple lift and shift of everything, a big bang, so to speak, often fails because not everything is ready to go at the same time. And you don't take advantage of the learnings along the way. So the first one might be rocky as you start to move things over, and you'll get better at it as you go. Make sure that you involve the business and that the business is aware of what's going on and what their responsibilities are, but try to do it with minimal disruption to the business. You don't really want to take away from the day-to-day that the business is doing what they need to concentrate on to actually make things work. You want to give them the tools, you want to give them the advice, and you want to ultimately take a look at that process and try to work around it rather than going through it. You only want to move what's actually relevant to the business. So as in that example that Steve brought up, 50% of the data didn't have to be moved at all. And that's an important number because you're not only doing that for cost savings reasons, but there's risk associated with that data. And ultimately, once that data gets moved, how soon are you to look at that again? If you don't have a good review process in place for the data that you've moved in the old environment, are you going to have that in the new one? Are you going to develop that post-move? Or is it something that you can do prior to making that move and ultimately removing that data, or at least not shifting it as part of the project? And then really take advantage of what's been done to that data to date. If you have foldering in place, if you have a tool that classifies today, take advantage of that. If it's been working in the past, why throw that away as part of this move? But make sure that you're actually taking a look at that, making sure that it's still relevant, and then move that along with the data itself. And then, as with all projects, realistically, communication is key here. The individual users, the different areas of the business, and ultimately the data owners all need to understand where they stand in the process, what that process is going to be, and ultimately how it's going to affect them. The more you communicate, the better people will perceive this project. Even if you run into problems, if you communicate what those problems are and what the ultimate effect may be, they will be much better received than if it just goes into a black box and all of a sudden a user, an end user, or a business owner has to deal with that as a complete surprise. So just make sure that you can ultimately over communicate rather than not at all.
Yeah, if I may, can you go back for a moment? I think if I were doing migration right now, I would actually go discover and classify using some of the tools already instead of doing it after the fact. Because as you migrate and you put data out there, Steve mentioned an example earlier, you don't know what will happen. right? So I would do that. Communication definitely very critical. With whom to communicate? I think I would even encourage creating a RACI, right? Responsible, accountable, contributor, and informed. Some kind of outline like that, and make sure to over communicate, involve the data owners, representatives of users, and even your system admins. Because when you do this, you're also going to deal with identity management, right? You're going to migrate some of your Active Directory into, or replicate your on-prem Active Directory into Azure. So there are all kinds of technical details. I keep going back to that because it's really important. You don't want your migration to be just only data focused, because the data by itself doesn't work. There are systems around that. So you need to involve those, understand the limitations. What are really the migration limitations in terms of data? What are the tools that are available out there that are help you to migrate? And then, you gotta also, the cloud can be expensive as well, right? And cutting down the data that you migrate is good, but also what you migrate and how much of it you migrate is also needs to be looked at closely.
Fantastic. I know we've got a set of questions, so I'm going to whiz through this one so we can get to the questions. So I think there's some great questions coming through. So just as a quick recap, and again, uncover what you've got, identify, cleanse. A question came up about how do you delete stuff? Well, that's the big fear that everyone has about hitting that big delete button. You don't have to delete it. You could quarantine it. You could leave it behind and then come up with a corporate policy to manage when that data gets disposed of. So when we talk about eliminating data, it doesn't have to be physically deleting, because different businesses will take that at their own pace. But once we've done that initial cleansing and segregation of data, you want to model it, be able to organize, structure, tag it prior to the migration, and then maintain once we move to the M365 platform. And so just to finish off, from the ActiveNav and Ricoh side, we've built out repeatable processes and foundations for effective migrations and compliance. And we've done this for really large customers and really small customers, global and local. And it's all about pragmatic. Hopefully the thing that's come across from both all of us on the panel today is you've got to be pragmatic when you approach this. This isn't a technology problem. It's much bigger than that. It's a business problem and a business transformation problem. And the only way you're going to achieve success is to be pragmatic.
Wonderful. Thank you all. And as Steve had mentioned, we have a ton of great questions. So we'll use the last bit of the webinar for those. And I'll start with this one. How is the integrity of the data protected? For example, ensuring creation dates are not changed during migration.
Well, that's the beauty of ActiveNav working in conjunction with the Microsoft stack. For example, we can use the SharePoint migration tool, and we can provide the content and the metadata that then enables that content to be transitioned to M365. And all of that existing metadata is not stamped over, it's retained. So using ActiveNav, none of the integrity of the content is changed at all, with the obvious exception if we're injecting labels into the content. Obviously, we're putting that into the header. But aside from that, the integrity and the dates and everything else will not change.
Wonderful. So we'll move on to the next question. When migrating information, how do you address record retention schedules and policies?
Again, this is all to do with, sorry, Kenan?
Yeah, I was just going to say it's about a policy, right? First of all, you have to take into consideration what your company's specific policy is and government regulation, compliance regulation related retention policies are. And then you create those policies. And of course, as a matter of fact, in the cloud space, one of the things is that it can afford you a scalable storage solution, and you don't really have to worry about storage capacity limitation. So it all will pivot on the policy that you create.
And allied to that is one of the beauties of the preparing this data prior to migration, and I'm speaking specifically about the ActiveNav solution here, means that because we understand the context and the content of the file, where previously no one really knew, means that we can map that content against a retention schedule. So if you imagine we identify that this is a news release document that has a 1-year retention. Well, if we're able to identify there's 1,000 files on the shared drive that are 18 months plus old that are news releases, why would you want to migrate that to the cloud? Because it's past the retention period. And so by being able to map the content and identify that content means that we can also, as part of that quarantine or disposition process, we can say, this data is beyond retention. And therefore, what we can then do is it's not in scope for migration. Whether you delete it or whether you maintain it somewhere else, there's no need to migrate it because it's past the retention period.
Along the same lines, also for compliance requirements, right? If you have some PII data that you're not supposed to keep after 5 years and you're keeping it, on auditors come in, right? So you know that you can also do that, automatically delete, archive or delete, disposition that data.
So the next question we have, oh, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I was just going to say, just to piggyback off of that, there was a question about receiving sign-off from the business owners within. And in an ideal world, I would say yes, you would get sign-off on that, but ultimately, I think the decision has to be made at the policy level. So you need to get sign-off on the policy itself, and then let the policy determine what's going to happen. So in the example of a 2013 Christmas card, although some people may look back at that very fondly and love those, and you know, we have pictures sitting on our network or within our data store from past Christmas parties or parties that have happened. And from time to time, people love to go back and look at that. Ultimately, classifying that data up front and setting a policy to it will ultimately inform whether that stays or whether that goes or whether that gets migrated in this case.
Yeah.
Great points from all of you there. So thank you for those. Our next question is, how do you know when you're actually ready to migrate? Are there specific milestones you should meet?
That all comes down to the process and the methodology. And again, our recommendation, and again, as black that up today, is don't just do a lift and shift of everything, and don't try and do everything all in one foul swoop, because it is a challenge. And so coming up with using existing processes and methodologies, or coming up with your own, means that you can have that roadmap, because it's not a case of we've got this data and tomorrow it's going to be in the cloud, because there's change management, there's various steps, that process, like the data discovery, the cleanup, the workshops, the restructure, the tag, migrate. And so all of those can be built out into a project plan for those milestones and deliverables, because it may be that some of these migrations might start and take many months to complete because of the complexity of the organization and the volume of the data within that one business unit. And so having these processes and methodology in place are critical to success.
Even I think the timing is very important, you know, especially when you're migrating email. The size of the email is also important, because email, as you all know, is very critical for operating business. So you don't want your users to be out of email, you know, for more than a certain period of time. So, you know, make sure to understand the size limitations on what can be migrated, how much of it, and for how long would it take.
To add to this, I think the real risk to the business in terms of knowing when it's time to migrate or when the time is right to migrate is that you can get stuck in the planning process and never actually move beyond that. And we've seen that a number of times where it just goes round and round and round, where they don't quite feel ready, ultimately want to do more planning, get to a stage where they're almost ready, and then realize, oh, something else has come up, and it just essentially turns into a flywheel of indecision. And really what you want to do is put a project plan in place that says, when we reach these specific milestones, and those milestones are going to be determined by the business itself, then it's going to be time to take that plunge and actually do it. And also prepare your users for the simple fact that this is not going to be a completely smooth transition. It never is. Things come up as you go, and you have to react quickly to those, make changes, and make sure that you're adapting on the fly to work around that. And no amount of planning will make that perfect, but ultimately you want to do the right amount of planning that doesn't freeze you in place, but that eases that transition as much as possible. And ultimately, I would say personally, there is no absolute right time, but there is a time where you need to make that decision and take the jump.
Absolutely. So we'll end on one more question. And if you do have more questions, feel free to submit them. We will follow up with you after the webinar. But I think this one's particularly relevant as we're all working from home, or vast majority of us. What recommendations do you have to restrict employees from accessing M365 data on an unmanaged or personal device?
So this is where, if I may, this is where you have to look into the larger picture of security, right? We keep talking about zero trust security, where you have to actually explicitly verify and validate the devices meet your security requirements, right? So that will definitely take us into another topic, but definitely you no longer have, remember back in the days, it's hard to say that it's back in the days, where you had an IT issued machine that everybody uses coming into the office in this pristine controlled networking. That's not the case anymore. Perimeterless environment, bring your own devices, all kinds of devices. So you need to look into zero trust security, or SASE, we call it, right? Secure access, secure edge kind of security frameworks, and start implementing those, explicitly verifying and validating and providing least privilege to those users that need access to it. But that's a bigger topic.
Thank you. Wonderful. So again, thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to our panelists as well. We hope you enjoyed the webinar. And with that, we'll wrap up for today, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.